All right, D, religious practices. The Elba texts. Ebla, sorry. The Ebla texts reveal that many of the Old Testament religious practices are not as late as some critical scholars have espoused. In matters like priests, cults, and offerings, the records from Ebla so far merely reinforce for Syria and Palestine what we already know of for Egypt, Mesopotamia and Anatolia in the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st millennia BC, and from the records of North-Syrian Qatna and Ugarit for the 2nd millennium BC, namely that well-organized temple cults, sacrifices, rituals, etc., were a constant feature of ancient Near Eastern religious life at all periods, from prehistory down to Graeco-Roman times. They have nothing to do with baseless theories of the 19th century AD, where such features of religious life can only be a mark of late sophistication, virtually forbidden to the Hebrews until after Babylonian exile, alone of all the peoples of the ancient East. There is simply no rational basis for the quaint idea that the simple rites of Moses' tabernacle, in Leviticus cross-reference, or of Solomon's temple, both well over 1,000 years later, than the rituals practiced in half a dozen Eblaite temples, must be the idle invention of idealizing writers as late as the 5th century BC. Kitchen. Giovanni Pettinato comments on the source of the specifics referred to by Kitchen. Passing on to the divine cult, we note the existence of the temples of Dagon, Ashtar, Chemos, Resap, all attested in the text from Ebla. Among the offerings are listed bread, drinks, and even animals. 2 tablets in particular, these two, stand out because they record the offerings of various animals to different gods made by all the members of the royal family during a single month. For example, 11 sheep for the god Adad as an offering, 12 sheep for the god Dagon as an offering, 10 sheep for the god Resap of the city of Edeni as an offering. Among the more interesting aspects of the divine cult at Ebla is the presence of diverse categories of priests and priestesses, including 2 classes of prophets, the Mahu and the Nebiutum, the second of which finds a natural counterpart in the Old Testament. To explain the biblical phenomenon, scholars have hitherto looked to Mary for a background, but in the future Ebla will also claim their attention. We have Hebrew words. All right, Hebrew words. K.A. Kitchen speaks of the critical view of Scripture held by many liberal scholars. 70 or 100 years ago, no such vast depth of perspective was possible, and to suit the purely theoretical reconstructions of Old Testament books and history by German Old Testament scholars in particular, many words in Hebrew were labeled late 600 BC and later in effect. By this simple means, mere philosophical prejudices could be given the outward appearance of a scientific reconstruction down to the present day. How many people do that? As a reply, Kitchen continues, however, the immense growth in our knowledge of the earlier history of words found in Old Testament Hebrew tends now to alter all of this. If a given word is used in Ebla in 2300 BC and in Ugarit in 1300 BC, then it cannot, by any stretch of the imagination, be a late word, 600 BC, or an Aramaism at periods when standard Aramaic had not yet evolved. It becomes instead an early word, part of the ancestral inheritance of biblical Hebrew. More positively, the increased number of contexts that one gains for rarer words can provide useful confirmation or correction of our understanding of their meaning. We're referring to specific words, Kitchen states. Thus, to go back to the survey of city officials at Ebla, the term used for those scores of leaders was Nase, N-A-S-E, the same word as Nasi, a term in biblical Hebrew used for leaders of the tribes of Israel, Numbers 1, 16, and 44, and so on, and applied to other purely human rulers such as Solomon, 1 Kings 11:34. Old-fashioned biblical criticism declared the word to be late, a mark of the hypothetical priestly code, for example. The word hetem, gold, is in Hebrew a rare and poetic synonym for zahab, and is commonly dismissed as late. Unfortunately, for this misdating, the word was borrowed into Egyptian from Canaanite back in the 12th century BC, and now over 1,000 years earlier still, recurs as kutum in the Paleo-Canaanite of Ebla, 2300 BC. Kitchen continues. The word for taham, meaning deep, was not borrowed from Babylonian, seeing that it is attested not only in Ugaritic as Sumet, 13th century BC, but also in Ebla, 1,000 years earlier, Tiamatum. The term is common Semitic. As an example of a rare word confirmed in both existence and meaning, one may cite Hebrew ereshet, desire, which occurs just once in the Bible, in Psalm 21:2, Hebrews 21:3, besides being found in Ugaritic in the 13th century BC. This word now appears in the millennium, earlier as Ebla, as Irisetum, Eblaite, or Old Akkadian, in the Sumerian Eblaite vocabulary tablets. Finally, the supposed late verb hadash, hiddesh, be new, to renew, goes back again via Ugaritic hada to Eblaite, hiddeshu, and so on for many, many more besides. So Kitchen concludes. The lessons here are, or should be clear, set against 2,000 years of history and development of the West Semitic dialects, the whole position of the dating of the vocabulary and usages in biblical Hebrew will need to be completely re-examined. The truth appears to be that early West Semitic in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC had in common a vast and rich vocabulary to which the later dialects, such as Canaanite, Hebrew, Phoenician, Aramaic, etc., fell heirs, but in uneven measure. Words that remain in everyday prosaic use in one of these languages lingered on only in high-flown poetry or in traditional expressions in another of the group. Thus, not a few supposed late words or Aramaisms in Hebrew, especially in poetry, are nothing more than early West Semitic words that have found less use in Hebrew but have stayed more alive in the Aramaic language. 3. The flood of Noah. As with the creation accounts, the flood narrative in Genesis is more realistic and less mythological than other ancient versions, indicating its authenticity. The superficial similarities point toward a historical, okay. I don't know if I typed this wrong or not. Historical core of events that gave rise to all accounts, not toward plagiarism by Moses. The names change. Noah is called Zeusudra by the Sumerians and Utnapishtim by the Babylonians. The basic story doesn't. A man is told to build a ship to specific dimensions because God is going to flood the world. He does it, rides out the storm, and offers sacrifice upon exiting the boat. The deity, or deities, respect, the deities, or deity, responds with remorse over the destruction of life and makes a covenant with the man. These core events point to an historical basis. Similar flood accounts are found all over the world. The flood is told of by the Greeks, the Hindus, the Chinese, the Mexicans, the Algonquins, and the Hawaiians. One list of Sumerian kings treats the flood as an historical reference point. After naming 8 kings who lived extraordinarily long lives, tens of thousands of years, this sentence interrupts the list. Then the flood swept over the earth, and when kingship was lowered again from heaven, kingship was first in Kish. There are good reasons to believe that Genesis gives the original story. The other versions contain elaborations indicating corruption. Only in Genesis is the year of the flood given, as well as date for the chronology relative to Noah's life. In fact, Genesis reads almost like a diary or a ship's log of the events. The cubical Babylonian ship could not have saved anyone. The raging waters would have constantly turned it on every side. However, the biblical ark is rectangular, long, wide, and low, so that it would ride the rough seas well. The length of the rainfall in the pagan accounts, 7 days, is not enough for the devastation that they describe. The waters would have to rise at least above most mountains to a height of about 17,000 feet, and it is more reasonable to assume a longer rainfall to do this. The Babylonian idea that all of the flood waters subsided in one day is equally absurd. Another striking difference between Genesis and the other versions is that in these accounts, the hero is granted immortality and exalted. The Bible moves on to Noah's sin. Only a version that seeks to tell the truth would include this realistic admission. All right, now we have the Tower of Babel. There is now considerable evidence that the world did indeed have a single language at one time. Sumerian literature alludes to this fact several times. Linguists also find this theory helpful in categorizing languages. But what of the tower and the confusion of tongues at the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11? Archaeology has revealed that Ur-Nammu, king of Ur, from about 2044 to 2007 BC, supposedly received orders to build a great ziggurat, temple tower, as an act of worship to the moon god Nanat. A stele monument about 5 feet across and 10 feet high reveals Ur-Nammu's activities. One panel has him setting out with a mortar basket to begin construction of the great tower, thus showing his allegiance to the gods by taking his place as a humble workman. Another clay tablet states that the erection of the tower offended the gods, so they threw down what the men had built, scattered them abroad, and made their speech strange. This is remarkably similar to the record in the Bible. According to Scripture, the whole earth had one language and one speech before the Tower of Babel. After the building of the tower and its destruction, God confounded the language of all the earth. Genesis 11:9. Many modern-day philologists attest to the likelihood of such an origin of the world's languages. Alfredo Trombetti says he can trace and prove the common origin of all languages. Max Muller also attests to the common origin, and Otto Jespersen goes so far as to say that language was directly given to the first men by God. The patriarchs. While the narratives of the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob do not present the same kinds of difficulties as do the earlier chapters of Genesis, they were long considered legendary because they did not seem to fit with the known evidence of that period. As more has become known, though, these stories are increasingly verified. Legal codes from that time of Abraham show why the patriarch would have been hesitant to throw Hagar out of his camp, for he was legally bound to support her. Only when a higher law came from God was Abraham willing to put her out. Married tablets from the Euphrates.